Imagine an economy that managed to pull off what a lot of people would consider an absolute sociological miracle.
Right.
We're talking about a region that completely eradicated the historical gender gap in basic education, like turning out the most highly educated, completely literate generation of young women in its entire history.
It's an incredible baseline to start from.
Exactly. And you look at that and assume, an unprecedented economic boom is just right around the corner.
You'd think so, yeah.
But then you look at the actual labor market data and you realize that nearly a third of those brilliantly educated young women are sitting entirely idle.
Just completely locked out of the system.
Right. They aren't in universities, they aren't in job training, and they aren't in the workforce. They're not participating in the economic engine they were literally built to drive.
Which is a massive, glaring paradox.
And that paradox is exactly what we're unpacking today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are looking at the Latin America and the Caribbean region, or LCN as it's known institutionally.
I'm really glad we're tackling this. The structural mismatch in the LCN region is it's profound, and it's just one piece of a much larger, highly complex puzzle.
And to figure out this puzzle, we've got a really specific set of source material today. We're doing a deep dive into this incredible presentation deck based on World Bank macro indicators.
And the way this data is presented, we really have to talk about the visuals here because it's not what you'd expect.
No, not at all. I want you, the listener, to picture how you usually consume economic news.
Yeah.
Right? It's usually flashy graphics on a cable network, bright red arrows pointing down, loud primary colors.
Lots of 3D charts with drop shadows.
Exactly, lots of noise. But our source material today is this incredibly stark, purely academic presentation deck. It's designed with this strict, minimal aesthetic.
Pure white or very light gray background.
Yes, pure white, no 3D graphics allowed, absolutely no heavy decorative images, just the data, plotted using these really sophisticated, low-saturation Morandi colors.
It's like a slate blue or a dusty sage green, maybe a dark ochre.
Right. And the very first slide, the cover, it just sets the tone perfectly.
Oh,
You've got the title on the left, Structural Transformation and Development Trajectory in LCN, and on the right, it's just this abstract geometric network made of thin lines and scatter points.
Which is such an effective analytical tool, honestly, when you strip away all that aesthetic noise and just use simple thin arrows and circles to mark the data points.
You're forced to actually grapple with the raw scale of the numbers.
Exactly. You see the exact inflection points where millions of human lives change trajectory. And to understand how you end up with millions of highly educated but unemployed youth, you have to zoom out first.
Right. We have to look at the foundation of the economy itself. Slide 2 and 3 of this deck really dig into the macro picture, the raw accumulation of wealth.
And the scale we're looking at here is monumental. The raw gross domestic product, the total value of everything produced, it's skyrocketed.
We're talking about a baseline of roughly $729.3 billion that swells into this massive $5.39 trillion economy.
Yeah, trillion with a T. It's a massive leap.
But as the presentation points out, that macro number can be a bit, abstract. What really matters is how that wealth filters down to the individual on the street.
Right, and that's where slide 3 comes in. It tracks something called GNI per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
And visually, this is shown as this beautiful step-line chart, right?
Ugh.
A deep teal line just climbing upward.
Exactly, with a text box pointing out that this metric made a staggering leap. It grew more than 3 times over, from an initial baseline of about $605 to nearly $19,537.
Let's pause on that term for a second, purchasing power parity, because I know it gets thrown around in economics a lot, but it is the key to actually understanding what this data means for a normal person.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about a straight currency exchange rate here.
Right.
Purchasing power parity is essentially a way to measure the true cost of living because, a dollar buys you a very different amount of bread or cement or electricity in Bogota than it does in New York.
So when the chart shows that the GNI per capita adjusted for PPP multiplied by 3,
we are saying that the actual physical ability of an average individual in this region to buy the necessities of life tripled.
Wow. So on paper, and in the daily lives of the citizens, this looks like an absolute golden age. The pie is massively bigger, and everyone's slice is buying them 3 times as much.
But with macroeconomics, there is a massive caveat layered directly underneath this growth on slide 2.
The volatility.
Yes. The slide uses a combined chart It has that smooth, deep blue area chart showing the massive GDP growth on top, but right below it is this jagged gray bar chart tracking the year-over-year growth rate.
And it is a brutal roller coaster. The data shows these severe plunges into negative territory. They use these thin little circles to highlight the years where growth plummeted below zero, hitting negative 2.52% or even deeper.
And they label those with a downward arrow, simply calling them periods of economic recession. This is where we see the structural fragility of the region.
Massive overall wealth accumulation over the decades, but extreme unpredictability from one year to the next.
Exactly. The baseline is rising, but the foundation it rests on is constantly shifting underneath them.
It makes me think of like a roller coaster climbing up the side of a mountain. Geographically, objectively, your altitude is getting higher, right? You're further up the mountain than you were 20 years ago.
Right.
But the ride itself is terrifying. Your stomach is constantly dropping out. But my question is, how does volatility on that scale actually impact a country on the ground?
Whoa.
I mean, if the overall trajectory is still 3 times growth, shouldn't the volatility just be an uncomfortable bump in the road?
It's way more than a bump. It fundamentally alters psychology. High volatility destroys long-term planning horizons.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you're a government minister trying to plan a 10-year infrastructure project, or a business owner deciding whether to build a new factory.
Or just a family deciding if they can afford a mortgage.
Exactly. Extreme volatility forces you to hedge your bets. It strongly incentivizes short-term survival tactics over long-term systemic investment. You see capital flight. You see underinvestment in complex industries because the return timeline is just too long to risk.
You can't plan for a decade when you don't know what next year looks like.
Right. Yet, despite that deeply unstable environment, this region somehow managed to pull off some incredibly resilient long-term investments.
Which brings us to the next section of the deep dive, the human foundation. Slide 5, 6, and 8 of the deck cover this, and the numbers defy the pessimism you'd expect from such a volatile economy.
They really do. That is the great triumph recorded in this data set. Despite the economic whiplash, the society translated its growing wealth into a permanent human foundation.
Let's look at the infrastructure data on slide 5. It's this super minimal dashboard graphic, a flat icon of a city building next to a progress bar.
And the urban electrification rate started pretty high, sitting at 97.21%.
Which is already great.
But over the period tracked, that progress bar pushes all the way up to practically universal coverage, 99.9%.
Now, I look at a number like going from 97 to 99.9, and I immediately think, okay, that's just a tiny incremental bump.
Sure.
But I suspect that last 2.8% is carrying a lot more weight than it seems.
You're absolutely right to suspect that. The logistics of infrastructure dictate that the first 80% or so is relatively straightforward.
You wire up the dense city centers, the wealthy suburbs.
Exactly, because it's highly profitable for utility companies to do so. Getting to 97% is impressive, but getting from 97.21 to 99.9 is an entirely different logistical beast.
Because you're reaching the hardest places.
Right. You are dragging the modern grid into the most difficult, most peripheral, historically marginalized areas. The informal settlements, the deep favelas, the steep hillsides surrounding megacities where laying cable is just an engineering nightmare.
Wow. So that final fraction of a percent represents the most expensive and socially impactful electrification a government can undertake.
Exactly. It fundamentally changes the capacity of a neighborhood.
You aren't just turning on a light bulb. You're enabling refrigeration for food and medicine. You're powering computers for education.
Allowing small businesses to operate after dark.
Which flows perfectly into the next major data point on slide 6, education. They use a dumbbell plot here to show the start and end points connected by a dashed line labeled significant human capital accumulation.
And it is significant. The adult literacy rate, anyone 15 and older, climbed from roughly 71.12% to an incredibly impressive 95.23%.
And primary school completion hit roughly 95%.
Moving a society from a point where nearly 3 out of 10 adults cannot read to near universal literacy, I mean, that rewrites the operational code of a nation.
Yeah, it changes how you govern, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly you can communicate complex public health information via text.
It changes business because you have a workforce that can follow written manuals and operate software. It's the absolute prerequisite for a modern economy.
But the crowning achievement in this data set, the one that carries the most profound human weight, is on slide 8. The public health victory.
The infant mortality rate.
Yeah. Visually, this slide is striking. Pure white background and just this one downward-sloping dark ochre line.
following the female infant mortality rate.
And it doesn't just gradually decline. A massive gradient arrow follows the trend, pointing to a sheer cliff-like drop. It plummeted by nearly 70%.
Falling from 43.9 deaths per 1,000 live births to just 13.5.
To drop that steeply, that requires what? A massive coordinated effort. You don't just cut infant mortality by 70% by throwing money at one hospital.
Oh, absolutely not. You have to build out massive logistical networks. You need cold chains to keep vaccines viable as they're transported into rural areas.
Right.
You need widespread investments in basic sanitation and clean water because waterborne diseases are huge drivers of infant mortality. You need to train and deploy thousands of midwives and nurses.
So what this number proves is that despite the economic recessions and the volatile GDP growth, these foundational public health systems remained incredibly resilient.
And the cascading effect of that resilience is massive.
Yeah, if I put myself in the shoes of a family living in this region during that transition historically, high infant mortality leads to higher birth rates.
Right?
Because parents need to ensure some children survive to adulthood to support the family.
Exactly. It's a survival strategy.
But when you introduce clean water and maternal care, and you know with near certainty that your baby is going to survive, the psychology completely shifts.
It triggers what demographers call the demographic transition. Family planning changes. Women can enter the workforce with different expectations.
Families consolidate their resources. Instead of dividing income to feed 6 kids, they have 2 and invest heavily in their education.
That shift alone alters the entire sociology of a region.
So we have this incredible baseline established. The region got richer. They navigated the volatility to turn the lights on for almost everyone. They taught everyone to read, and they radically improved the survival rates of their children.
Objectively, an incredible reservoir of human potential.
But this brings us back to that glaring paradox we opened the show with. Because getting a population healthy and educated is really only half the battle.
You have to integrate them into an economy that actually uses those skills.
And that transition from the classroom to the labor market is where we hit the most frustrating bottleneck in the data. Slides 7, 12, and 13, they look at the intersection of gender, education, and labor.
Let's start with the academic triumph on slide 7, because the numbers are unequivocal. They use a double-line chart to track youth literacy, and the lines for men and women overlap so perfectly they had to use light gray for men and dark blue for women just to tell them apart.
Because in basic education, the gender gap has been completely wiped out. Female youth literacy, young women between 15 and 24, sits at an astonishing 99.6%.
Matching the men exactly.
Furthermore, female primary school completion jumped from historically sitting under 50% all the way up to 97%. They completely levered the playing field.
It's a monumental achievement in social policy. But then you look at slide 12, which tracks the labor market, and it tells a vastly different story.
The invisible wall?
Exactly. They use a slope graph here to compare early and recent data, and while female employment did rise, moving from under 40% to roughly 47%,
there's this massive vertical gap left between the male and female lines. They literally draw a double-sided arrow to highlight the persistent gender employment gap.
Right. And then slide 13 brings out the ultimate crisis warning light for the region, the NEET rate.
N-E-E-T, not in education, employment, or training.
Right. The slide shows the stark scatter plot with a red dashed circle highlighting the extreme end of the data.
The proportion of young women classified as NEET hovers between 24% and a staggering 29%.
Nearly 1 in 3. The most highly educated, universally literate generation of women in the region's history, sitting entirely outside the economic system.
It's what economists call idle human capital, right?
Yes. And from a developmental perspective, it represents a massive systemic failure.
I want to push back on this a little, though, because when people hear that stat, the immediate assumption is often cultural. They assume, oh, traditional gender roles are just keeping women at home.
Right. That's the standard narrative.
Is a 29% idle rate purely the result of cultural expectations, or is there a structural breakdown happening here?
It's inevitably a combination, but the structural barriers are deeply underappreciated. Yes, cultural expectations regarding domestic duties play a role. However, the structural reality of the care economy is usually the actual deciding factor.
How so?
Even when a woman possesses a 99.6% literacy rate and the absolute desire to work, the burden of unpaid care, raising children, caring for elderly parents, managing the household, falls disproportionately on her.
And if the state hasn't built out the infrastructure to support that care?
Precisely. If there are no robust, affordable, state-sponsored childcare systems, or if the elderly care infrastructure is non-existent, she simply cannot translate her education into a formal job.
It's a math problem with her daily hours.
Exactly. It isn't just a cultural preference, it is a hard structural reality.
It's like building a high-performance sports car engine, but completely failing to install a transmission. The engine is revving, the education is there, but the society isn't moving forward because the gears don't connect.
That analogy gets right to the heart of the issue, but, the lack of care infrastructure is really only one side of those mismatched gears.
That's the other side.
To truly understand why these young women and youth in general are struggling to find meaningful employment, we have to look at what the economy is actually producing, the demand side.
Which brings us to Section 4, the changing shape of the economy. Slide 9, 10, and 11. We've talked about the people. Now we have to talk about the machine they're trying to work inside.
And the data shows a massive structural shift. Slide 9 uses a thin horizontal bar chart to show the value added of the agricultural sector. It dropped by more than half, falling from over 11% of the region's GDP to just about 5%.
Shrinking the agricultural base, which is the standard mechanism of modernization, right?
Yeah. As farming becomes mechanized, it requires less manual labor. That's the exact force that drove the massive urbanization we saw earlier, people migrating from rural farms into those megacities.
But the textbook economic model says that when people leave the farms, they go to the factories. An economy is supposed to move from agrarian to industrial to a high-end service economy.
Right.
But slide 10 shows the LCN region seems to have short-circuited that process.
They fell victim to what development economists call premature deindustrialization. Historically, they did experience a massive industrial boom. Industry and manufacturing previously peaked at over 50% of the GDP.
But then it hit a wall. Slide 10 uses a step area chart, and the gray industrial base just flatlines. It hovers stubbornly between 30 and 33% of GDP. It just stagnated. Why? What stalled the industrial engine?
This is where global context is crucial. The region didn't industrialize in a vacuum. As they were trying to expand their manufacturing base, they ran head-on into the explosive rise of Asian manufacturing powerhouses, particularly China.
So they got caught in the squeeze.
Exactly. The middle income trap. Their early growth and wealth accumulation meant their labor was no longer the cheapest in the world. They couldn't compete with the rock-bottom manufacturing wages in Asia.
But they also hadn't built the high-tech R&D to compete with the US or Germany.
Right. Too rich to be the world's sweatshop, but not technologically advanced enough to be the world's laboratory.
So the factories stall out at 33% of the GDP.
Yeah.
But here is where the data gets genuinely confusing for me, and I need you to clarify this.
Sure.
Because while the industrial sector is stagnating on slide 10, the employment data on slide 11 says something entirely different.
The dual-axis line chart.
Yeah. It explicitly states that overall employment remained highly stable, sitting right in that 57 to 59% zone. And more surprisingly, it says the labor market formalized. Wage and salaried workers rose to over 64%.
Right.
So if the factories aren't hiring and agriculture is shrinking, where on earth are 64% of the workers getting formal wages?
It is the critical question. When manufacturing stagnates but formal wage labor rises, you are almost certainly looking at a massive swelling of the service sector. But we have to be very careful with the word services.
Because in a highly advanced economy, services mean software engineering, corporate law, advanced medical care.
High productivity, high wage jobs.
Okay.
Exactly. But in an economy experiencing premature deindustrialization, the service sector that absorbs this massive influx of urban workers is largely low to mid-tier.
So we're talking retail chains, local delivery, basic administrative clerking, food service.
Yes. These are formal jobs. They pay a documented wage. They might offer basic state benefits, which is why they show up nicely in that 64% formalization statistic.
Right.
And this is the critical flaw, they are low productivity jobs. They do not drive rapid exponential economic growth. And most importantly, they do not utilize the high-level skills of that universally literate, highly educated younger generation.
Wow, that perfectly connects the dots.
Yeah.
You have a society that did the hard work of educating its population, hitting that 99.6% female literacy.
Mm-hmm.
But because the manufacturing sector stalled out and the high-tech service sector hasn't fully materialized, you have brilliant young minds competing for basic retail jobs or simply opting out of a labor market that offers no upward mobility.
It's an economy dressed up for a high-tech future that hasn't arrived yet.
And that structural stagnation is taking place against a backdrop of immense temporal pressure. They don't have a luxury of spending another 50 years figuring out their industrial strategy.
No, they are running out of time on two completely irreversible fronts.
Which brings us to the final major data sets, demographics and the environment. Let's look at slide 4 first, the demographic shift. Because the speed of this transformation is staggering.
The visual here is a 100% stacked area chart in muted blues and grays.
And it shows the youth population, kids aged 0 to 14, plummeting from roughly 43% of the total population down to just 23.2%.
While the working age population, 15 to 64, expanded to a massive 67.4%.
And the elderly population, 65 and older, nearly tripled, jumping from 3.2% to 9.3%.
This tracks the arc of the demographic dividend. We touched on the demographic transition earlier, when dropping infant mortality leads to smaller families.
Right.
When that transition happens, a country enters a golden window of economic potential. You have a massive bulge of working-age people and relatively few dependents.
Meaning fewer kids requiring immense school resources and not yet enough elderly people draining the pension systems.
Yeah.
Maximum producers, minimum dependence.
Exactly. And the data shows the LCN region is standing directly in the center of that golden window right now. 67.4% working age is a massive engine for potential growth.
But the other two numbers, the youth halving and the elderly tripling, are screaming that this window is rapidly slamming shut.
Because in 20 or 30 years, that massive bulge of workers is going to age into retirement.
And they'll become a massive elderly population needing advanced medical care and pensions.
Mm-hmm.
But because the youth population shrank to 23%, there will be a significantly smaller workforce coming up behind them to generate the tax revenue needed to support them.
This is what demographers call the scissor gap. If you graph the youth dropping and the elderly rising, it looks like the two blades of a pair of scissors closing in on each other.
The space between the blades is the demographic dividend.
Right, and you can literally see time running out. It creates this absolute developmental imperative. You have to get rich before you get old.
Get rich before you get old. That's a brutal rule.
It's inescapable. If a society transitions into a top-heavy aging demographic while they're still stuck in the middle-income trap with stalled industries and massive youth unemployment, they face a severe economic crisis.
The tax base just won't be able to support the societal load.
No.
But the demographic clock isn't the only thing ticking. Slide 14 shows they're also racing against the environmental cost of their own development.
The carbon emissions chart.
Yes, it's a stacked bar chart. And it shows carbon emissions specifically excluding land use change and forestry, so we're focusing purely on industrial and urban output, have essentially doubled.
Climbing from roughly 550.19 million tons to over 1,000 million tons.
And the nuance here is critical, right? Because we already established their industrial sector stagnated at 33%. So this isn't a massive boom in heavy polluting steel or coal factories.
No, the data explicitly points out that this carbon increase is heavily driven by buildings, energy use, and waste.
This is the carbon footprint of human progress.
Exactly. It is the inescapable cost of that 99.9% urban electrification rate we celebrated earlier.
Because when you move millions of people from rural poverty into the urban middle class, they buy refrigerators, they turn on air conditioners.
They buy packaged goods that generate municipal waste. Their new apartment buildings require concrete and steel. The doubling of carbon emissions is the direct byproduct of their rising purchasing power.
So they are caught in a dual race. They have to figure out how to unlock their stalled economy and get rich before their population ages out of the workforce,
while simultaneously decoupling their growth from carbon emissions. Because if agriculture fails due to climate shifts, or coastal megacities face infrastructure collapse, it won't matter what their GDP is.
It's an incredibly delicate balancing act, which brings us perfectly to the conclusion of this presentation. Slide 15, the final synthesis.
It lays everything out holistically.
Yeah, it's a simple, stark, 4-quadrant matrix, no extra charts, just text and minimal lines guiding your eyes. Let's walk through it. Top right quadrant, the achievements.
Purchasing power multiplied. Infant mortality plummeted by 70%.
Top left quadrant, the transformation.
Agriculture shrunk to 5%. The population aged, shrinking the youth demographic.
Bottom right quadrant,
the
challenges.
Carbon emissions doubled, driven by energy and waste.
And finally, bottom left quadrant, the hidden worries.
Nearly 30% of young women economically idle, classified as NEET, trapped behind invisible structural walls.
You know, when you lay it out like that, It completely shatters the illusion that economic development is just a straight line pointing up and to the right.
It's never a straight line.
You can't just build schools and hospitals and assume the rest will fix itself. You can flawlessly execute the human development side. You can make your population healthy, literate, and equal. But if you don't evolve your labor markets,
If you don't build the infrastructure for a care economy or navigate the realities of global industrial competition.
you end up with a heartbreaking paradox. A highly educated generation with absolutely nowhere to go, sitting idle while the clock ticks down on their demographic youth.
It is a sobering reality, but, I do not think it is a fatalistic one. No. In fact, if we look at the exact nature of those hidden worries, I think there is a massive, unconventional opportunity waiting to be unlocked. I want to leave you and the listener with a final thought to mull over.
I'm intrigued. Where does the data point us next?
Well, we spent a lot of time discussing how the region hit a manufacturing bottleneck, how they couldn't compete with Asia in building 20th century factories.
Right.
But we are living in the 2020s. We have just witnessed a massive, permanent global leap in digital technology, telecommunications, and the normalization of remote, borderless work.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Think about the unique assets the LCN region holds right now. They have a 99.9% electrified, highly urbanized environment. They have a universally literate youth population. And crucially, they have millions of highly educated young women sitting idle, often because of a lack of physical care infrastructure that prevents them from commuting to traditional 9-to-5 jobs.
But if the work is digital, you don't need a traditional factory. You don't necessarily even need to leave your home, which completely bypasses the lack of care infrastructure.
Exactly. Does this region actually need to build heavy industry to escape the middle income trap? What if that 33% industrial stagnation isn't a permanent trap, but an opportunity to leapfrog?
Oh, wow.
Instead of trying to restart the gray factories of the past, they are perfectly positioned to export their human capital digitally.
Global service outsourcing, software development, creative digital industries.
Remote administration. All of these require exactly what the region has already built: consistent electricity, absolute literacy, and untapped human bandwidth.
That is a brilliant reframing. It takes that deeply depressing 29% neat statistic and flips it on its head. It isn't just a systemic failure. It is the largest, most potent, untapped economic reserve in the hemisphere.
The human capital is already built. The asset isn't missing. It just needs a digital transmission to connect it to the global engine.
The foundation is there. The question for the next decade is simply how they choose to deploy it.
Exactly.
And that is the perfect provocative thought to end on. Thank you to everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers. It is so easy to get lost in the sheer scale of trillions of dollars and macroeconomic theories. But remember, behind every single data point, behind every simple circle on a minimalist chart, is a human life. A family planning their future, a young woman looking for an opportunity, a society trying to navigate its way forward. We will see you next time.